Picture this. A young monk sits in his cell in 13th century Italy, quill trembling in his hand as he writes the most terrifying words ever committed to parchment. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Dante Alighieri wasn't just crafting poetry, he was documenting a vision that would haunt humanity for 7 centuries. But here's what will shock you. Dante's hell, as brutal as it seems, was actually considered merciful compared to what medieval theologians truly believed awaited the damned. The concept of infinite punishment for finite crimes represents perhaps the most disturbing idea ever conceived by human minds, yet it has shaped the beliefs of billions and influenced the course of civilizations. We're not talking about a few bad years in purgatory or even a lifetime of suffering. We're talking about conscious, deliberate, exquisite torture that never ends, never diminishes, never offers even a moment's respite. Not for a million years, not for a trillion years, not even after the heat death of the universe itself. But how did this idea take root in human consciousness? Where did it come from? And why did otherwise compassionate people not only accept it, but actively promote it as divine justice? The answers will take us through secret theological debates, political machinations, psychological experiments, and philosophical puzzles that have stumped the greatest minds in history. The story begins not in the fires of hell, but in the quiet corridors of power where religious doctrine is born. In 543 CE, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian faced a problem that threatened to tear apart his empire. A brilliant theologian named Origen had proposed something radical, that hell might not be eternal. Perhaps, Origen suggested, even the devil himself could eventually be redeemed through God's infinite love. The idea was gaining popularity among Christians, and Justinian realized it posed a serious threat to social order. Think about it from his perspective. If people believed their worst sins would eventually be forgiven anyway, what would stop them from rebellion, theft, or murder? The fear of eternal punishment wasn't just theology, it was the ultimate enforcement mechanism. Justinian convened a council and declared Origen's teachings heretical. With the stroke of a pen, he condemned billions of future souls to infinite suffering, not because God demanded it, but because the empire required it. This political calculation had profound consequences that ripple through our world today. The doctrine of eternal hell became orthodoxy in Christianity, but it was always contested, always questioned by those who couldn't reconcile infinite punishment with divine love. What emerged was a theological arms race, with each generation of scholars trying to make hell seem more justified, more necessary, more horrifyingly real. St. Augustine, perhaps the most influential Christian theologian, after Paul wrestled with this problem for decades. How could a perfectly good God create beings knowing they would suffer eternally? Augustine's solution was revolutionary and terrifying. He argued that the damned don't suffer against God's will. They suffer because they choose to continue sinning even in hell. In his vision, hell's residents wake up each day and consciously decide to hate God, thus earning fresh punishment. It was an elegant theological solution that made God blameless while making the tortured complicit in their own agony. But Augustine's hell spawned an even more disturbing question that would obsess theologians for 1,000 years. What about babies who died before baptism? If hell was the default destination for all humans due to original sin, then infants who died unbaptized were technically damned. Augustine himself admitted this logical conclusion, arguing that unbaptized babies suffered in hell, though perhaps less severely than adult sinners. Imagine being a medieval parent, losing a child in infancy, already the most devastating experience possible, and then being told by your priest that your baby was burning in hell for eternity because you hadn't gotten to the church in time. The psychological cruelty was so extreme that later theologians invented limbo, a sort of pleasant prison for innocent souls, just to avoid the implications of their own doctrine. Here's where the story takes a fascinating turn into the realm of mathematics and philosophy. Medieval scholars, particularly Thomas Aquinas, realized they had a serious logical problem on their hands. They believed human souls were immortal and that finite beings couldn't commit infinite sins. How then could infinite punishment be just? Aquinas' solution reveals the terrifying creativity of religious reasoning under pressure. He argued that while humans are finite, their sins against an infinite God somehow acquire infinite weight. To illustrate this principle, he used an analogy that would make any parent's blood run cold. If a peasant strikes another peasant, it's assault. If he strikes a nobleman, it's a more serious crime. If he strikes a king, it's treason worthy of death. Therefore, when a human sins against the infinite God, the offense itself becomes infinite, deserving infinite punishment. This reasoning satisfied theologians for centuries, but it opened doors to even darker implications. If any sin against God was infinite, then all sins were equally deserving of eternal torture. The grandmother who occasionally gossips about her neighbors burns alongside Hitler. The teenager who tells a white lie to his parents shares the same infinite punishment as a serial killer. In the mathematics of eternity, all finite crimes become exactly equal. I'm Professor Archive, and I spend my time excavating the ideas that have shaped human civilization, often in ways we've forgotten or prefer not to remember. Before we go deeper into this theological rabbit hole, I'm curious, where are you watching this from? Are you somewhere where these ideas still hold sway? Or are you in a place where hell has become more metaphor than reality? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you're finding this exploration as unsettling and fascinating as I do, consider supporting this research with a super thanks. The psychological impact of infinite punishment doctrine becomes even more chilling when we examine how it was taught to children throughout Christian history. Medieval and early modern education was built around the assumption that children needed to be terrified into virtue. Textbooks routinely described hell in graphic detail, complete with illustrations of demons torturing souls with creative and endless variety. But perhaps no one perfected the art of hell-based terror like Jonathan Edwards, the 18th century American preacher whose sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," became the template for fire and brimstone Christianity. Edwards had a gift for making infinite suffering feel immediate and personal. He would tell his congregation that they were dangling over hell like spiders on a thread, held back only by God's momentary whim. He described hell's heat as infinitely beyond the hottest earthly fire. Hell's darkness is deeper than any night. Hell's despair is more complete than any earthly sorrow. What made Edwards particularly effective was his understanding of psychology. He recognized that humans struggle to truly comprehend infinity, so he would ground his descriptions in finite but enormous numbers. He would tell his listeners to imagine suffering for 1,000,000 years, then realize they hadn't even begun their punishment. Then 1,000,000,000 years, 1,000,000,000,000 years, and still, eternity stretched ahead unchanged. He understood that the human mind would eventually break under the weight of trying to process such duration, and in that breaking, faith would be born from terror. The records from Edwards's revivals reveal the psychological carnage left in his wake. People would collapse during his sermons, screaming for mercy. Others would spend days unable to eat or sleep, paralyzed by the certainty of their damnation. Children as young as 5 would have nervous breakdowns, convinced they were destined for hell. Edwards considered this evidence of the Holy Spirit's work, never questioning whether terrorizing children into faith might contradict the loving God he claimed to represent. But Edwards's approach revealed a fundamental contradiction that had always lurked within infinite punishment doctrine. If hell was truly the fate awaiting the majority of humanity, and if this fate was infinitely worse than any earthly suffering, then the most moral thing anyone could do would be to prevent births entirely. Every parent who brought a child into the world was essentially playing Russian roulette with that child's eternal soul, since most children would grow up to be damned. Some Christians actually reached this logical conclusion. The Shakers, a Christian sect that practiced complete celibacy, justified their position partly by arguing that it was cruel to bring souls into a world where they would likely be damned. Other groups went even further, concluding that if hell was real, then murder might sometimes be mercy. Killing someone in a moment of grace could save them from later damnation. These weren't fringe philosophical exercises. Real people made real decisions based on infinite punishment doctrine that destroyed lives and families. The Catholic Church's records contain numerous accounts of parents abandoning or even killing children they believed were predestined for hell, reasoning that early death was preferable to certain damnation. The doctrine also created what philosophers now recognize as ethical paradoxes that have never been satisfactorily resolved. If infinite punishment awaits anyone who dies in sin, then proportional response to evil becomes impossible. A parent whose child is kidnapped and murdered should logically be more concerned about the kidnapper's eternal soul than about justice in this life, since the kidnapper's infinite suffering would infinitely outweigh any temporal crime. This reasoning led to the bizarre situation where Christians were theoretically commanded to love their enemies, not despite their crimes, but because of their impending infinite torture. The human conscience rebels against such calculations, but the logic was ironclad given the premises. Perhaps most disturbing was how infinite punishment doctrine affected the believer's relationship with God. If you truly believed that God was actively torturing billions of souls at every moment and would continue doing so forever, how could you genuinely love such a being? The psychological solution was to redefine love itself. Christian theologians developed elaborate theories about how God's justice was an expression of his love, how eternal torture somehow demonstrated divine compassion, how infinite punishment was actually a gift to the universe's moral order. These mental gymnastics created what psychologists now recognize as a form of theological Stockholm syndrome. Believers learned to identify with their cosmic captor, to see infinite cruelty as infinite love, to worship a God who threatened them with torture worse than anything human tyrants ever devised. They had to believe they deserved hell, that everyone they loved deserved hell, and that God's decision to torture most of humanity forever was not only just but beautiful. The historical record shows how this doctrine shaped medieval and early modern society in ways we're still uncovering. Legal systems incorporated the fear of hell as a deterrent so powerful that earthly punishment seemed trivial by comparison. The threat of excommunication, essentially a death sentence to hell, gave the church power over kings and emperors. Entire wars were fought with the promise that dying in holy combat would guarantee heaven, while dying in opposition to the church would guarantee eternal torture. But perhaps most insidiously, infinite punishment doctrine created a permanent industry of religious anxiety that reshaped human psychology across centuries. Since no one could be certain of their salvation, and since the consequences of being wrong were infinitely catastrophic, rational people lived in constant fear. This fear created markets for indulgences, pilgrimages, relics, and countless other religious products that promised to reduce the risk of eternal torture. The psychological toll was enormous. Medical records from medieval and early modern periods are filled with cases of what we would now recognize as religious trauma disorder. People spent lifetimes paralyzed by scrupulosity, obsessively confessing minor sins out of fear that any unconfessed transgression would damn them forever. Others developed what theologians called despair of salvation, the conviction that their damnation was certain, leading to suicide or complete abandonment of moral behavior. Yet throughout this dark history, there were always voices of dissent. Hidden in monastic libraries and heretical texts were alternative visions of divine justice that emphasized restoration over retribution, healing over punishment, universal salvation over selective damnation. These ideas were dangerous to express openly. Suggesting that hell might not be eternal could result in execution, but they never completely disappeared. The Reformation brought these suppressed questions to the surface. If salvation came through faith alone rather than through church sacraments, what happened to all the people who lived before Christianity? Were they automatically damned? What about virtuous pagans like Aristotle or Plato? Protestant reformers found themselves defending positions that seemed to damn most of humanity, while saving a small minority based on accident of birth and geography. This problem became even more acute as European exploration revealed the existence of millions of people in the Americas, Africa, and Asia who had never heard of Christianity. Were all these souls burning in hell for rejecting a gospel they never had the opportunity to hear? The moral implications were so troubling that they sparked centuries of debate about the fate of the unevangelized and provided partial justification for colonial missions that destroyed indigenous cultures in the name of salvation. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn toward hope. The very extremity of infinite punishment doctrine eventually became its weakness. As human moral intuitions evolved and as scientific understanding expanded, the idea that finite beings deserved infinite torture began to seem not just impossible but actively evil. The 19th and 20th centuries witnessed what religious historians call the Great Doctrinal Retreat from Hell. This retreat happened gradually and often without explicit acknowledgement. Sermons about hell became rarer. Sunday school curricula began emphasizing God's love over divine wrath. Hell transformed from a literal place of physical torture to a metaphorical state of separation from God. Many Christians began to hope for universal salvation while stopping short of declaring it doctrine. The psychological and philosophical problems with infinite punishment had finally overwhelmed its usefulness as a tool of social control. Modern parents couldn't bring themselves to threaten their children with eternal torture. Modern believers couldn't reconcile infinite love with infinite cruelty. Modern theologians couldn't solve the logical contradictions that had plagued the doctrine for 16 centuries. Yet the retreat from hell created new problems that religious communities are still grappling with today. If hell isn't real, what motivates moral behavior? If everyone eventually goes to heaven, what makes faith necessary? If God doesn't punish sin eternally, how do we understand justice? These questions have contributed to the broader decline of religious belief in developed societies, as communities that abandoned their most powerful threat discovered they had also abandoned their most compelling reason for faith. The story becomes even more complex when we examine how infinite punishment doctrine migrated beyond Christianity into secular ideologies. The structure of hell, infinite punishment for finite crimes, determined by ideological purity rather than proportional justice, appears in various forms throughout totalitarian movements. The communist gulags, the Nazi concentration camps, the Khmer Rouge killing fields all embodied the same basic logic. Certain categories of people deserve unlimited suffering for their inherent sinfulness, whether defined as bourgeois corruption, racial impurity, or intellectual contamination. This isn't to say that secular atrocities were caused by religious doctrine, but rather that infinite punishment thinking created psychological templates that could be applied to non-religious contexts. Once humans accepted that infinite torture could be justified in principle, it became easier to justify finite but extreme torture in practice. The theological normalization of unlimited cruelty may have prepared the ground for ideological cruelty that shocked the world in the 20th century. Modern psychology has provided new insights into why infinite punishment doctrine appealed to so many people for so many centuries, despite its obvious moral problems. Research into authoritarian personality types reveals that some individuals find psychological comfort in systems that promise absolute order through absolute punishment. The certainty that evil will receive exact retribution provides emotional satisfaction that mercy and rehabilitation cannot match. But the same research reveals that exposure to infinite punishment doctrine, especially in childhood, can cause lasting psychological damage. Children who are taught they deserve infinite torture for minor transgressions often develop profound self-hatred that persists into adulthood. Adults who believe their loved ones might be eternally tortured experience chronic anxiety and depression. Communities organized around infinite punishment doctrine tend towards social rigid hierarchy, suppression of dissent, and cycles of abuse that mirror their celestial model. Perhaps most importantly, modern neuroscience has revealed that the human brain simply cannot process infinite concepts meaningfully. When people claim to believe in eternal hell, they're necessarily believing in something they cannot truly comprehend. This cognitive limitation may explain why infinite punishment doctrine was so psychologically destructive. It forced humans to organize their lives around a concept that exceeded their mental capacity to understand. The mathematical reality of infinity makes infinite punishment particularly absurd when examined closely. In true infinity, no amount of suffering makes progress toward completion. After a trillion years of torture, an infinite sentence hasn't diminished by any measurable amount. This means that at any point in eternity, no matter how much suffering has already occurred, the remaining punishment is exactly as long as when it began. The concept violates basic human intuitions about justice, progress, and purposeful action. Yet these mathematical impossibilities were precisely what made infinite punishment so theologically attractive. Earlier theologians understood that threatening people with very long but finite sentences wouldn't have the same psychological impact. A million years of suffering, however horrible, still offers hope for eventual release. Only infinite suffering provides the absolute despair that terror-based religion required. The decline of belief in infinite punishment represents one of the most significant moral developments in human history, though it's rarely recognized as such. Abandoning the idea that conscious beings deserve unlimited torture has required humans to develop more sophisticated approaches to justice, meaning, and moral motivation. Instead of preventing evil through ultimate terror, modern societies must prevent evil through education, opportunity, rehabilitation, and proportional consequences. This transition hasn't been entirely successful. Crime rates haven't disappeared with the decline of hell belief, and many societies struggle to maintain social cohesion without ultimate religious sanctions. But the moral progress is undeniable. Humans who reject infinite punishment as unjust are forced to develop more humane approaches to justice that respect the dignity of all persons, even persons who have committed serious crimes. The story of infinite punishment doctrine also reveals how theological ideas evolve in response to political and social pressures. Hell wasn't discovered through divine revelation that gradually became clearer over time. Instead, it was constructed through human reasoning, motivated by very human concerns about power, control, and social order. Each generation of theologians modified the doctrine to address new challenges, creating an elaborate intellectual edifice that eventually collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. This process of theological evolution continues today as religious communities grapple with scientific discoveries that make traditional concepts of hell seem increasingly implausible. If consciousness emerges from brain activity, what burns in hell after the brain decomposes? If the universe will eventually experience heat death, where is eternal fire maintained? If moral understanding develops through social learning, how are isolated souls in hell supposed to repent? These questions don't definitively disprove hell, but they force believers to develop increasingly abstract and metaphorical interpretations that bear little resemblance to the vivid torture chambers that once motivated Christian behavior. Modern hell has become so ethereal that it no longer generates the existential terror that once drove people to faith. The psychological liberation from infinite punishment doctrine has been one of the unrecognized benefits of secular modernity. Humans no longer need to live in constant fear of cosmic torture for minor infractions. Parents no longer need to threaten children with eternal burning to encourage good behavior. Communities no longer need to organize around the shared terror of divine wrath. This liberation has costs as well as benefits. Some people find life less meaningful without ultimate consequences for moral choices. Others discover that removing infinite punishment makes finite suffering seem less significant by comparison. Still, others worry that abandoning hell removes necessary constraints on human behavior that secular ethics cannot replace. But for many, escape from infinite punishment doctrine represents a profound relief that enables genuine moral development for the first time. Instead of obeying moral rules from fear of unlimited torture, humans must develop internal moral compasses based on empathy, reason, and care for others' well-being. Instead of loving God to avoid hell, humans must find other reasons for spiritual development. Instead of viewing themselves as infinitely guilty creatures who deserve infinite punishment, humans can aspire to growth, improvement, and redemption. The theological retreat from infinite punishment has also enabled more sophisticated approaches to the problem of evil that originally motivated hell doctrine. Instead of solving the problem by threatening infinite punishment for finite crimes, modern thinkers explore how suffering might serve developmental purposes, how free will might require the possibility of moral failure, how justice might be served through restoration rather than retribution. These approaches don't definitively solve the ancient problem of evil, but they avoid creating new problems worse than the ones they attempt to address. A God who permits finite suffering while working for universal healing seems more credible than a God who actively maintains infinite torture chambers for the majority of creation. The historical journey from widespread belief in infinite punishment to growing rejection of the idea reveals something important about moral progress. Humans are capable of recognizing and abandoning even deeply entrenched ideas when those ideas conflict sufficiently with expanding moral intuitions. The same species that once accepted infinite torture as divine justice has gradually developed ethical frameworks that recognize such punishment as inherently evil. This evolution continues today as questions about justice, punishment, and mercy play out in contexts from criminal law to international relations to personal relationships. The principles that led humans to question infinite punishment in theology also drive contemporary movements for prison reform, restorative justice, and conflict resolution that emphasize healing over harm. Perhaps most remarkably, the story of infinite punishment doctrine demonstrates both the creative power and the ultimate limitations of human reasoning in service of predetermined conclusions. Brilliant minds spent centuries developing elaborate justifications for infinite torture, creating intellectual systems of enormous complexity and sophistication. Yet these same systems ultimately crumbled when their foundational assumptions were questioned. This pattern suggests reasons for both humility and hope. Humility because ideas that seem obviously true to one generation may seem obviously false to the next. Hope because even deeply entrenched beliefs that cause immense suffering can eventually be recognized and abandoned as human moral understanding develops. The hellish truth about infinite punishment may be that it reveals more about human psychology than divine justice. For centuries, humans projected their own capacity for unlimited cruelty onto their conception of God, creating theological systems that justified and normalized the very impulses that caused the worst suffering in human history. Recognizing this projection and moving beyond it represents a crucial step in humanity's moral development. Whether motivated by religious conviction or secular philosophy, the rejection of infinite punishment as unjust opens space for more hopeful approaches to the fundamental questions that hell doctrine attempted to address. How do we motivate moral behavior? How do we respond to evil? How do we understand justice? How do we find meaning in a universe that contains enormous suffering? These questions remain as urgent as ever, but they can now be addressed without requiring belief in unlimited torture for finite beings. That's Professor Archive, examining the ideas that have shaped human civilization in ways both obvious and hidden. The story of infinite punishment doctrine reminds us that even our most sacred beliefs deserve careful scrutiny, especially when they involve unlimited harm to conscious beings. If this exploration has challenged or intrigued you, hit subscribe for more deep dives into the intellectual history that continues shaping our world. And if you found value in this research, please support it with a super thanks. Until next time, keep questioning the ideas that claim ultimate authority, especially when they demand infinite prices for finite mistakes.